Sometimes the loneliest souls find each other in the most unexpected ways. Samuel Creek had given up on love 15 years ago, living as a mountain man in Colorado's frozen wilderness, speaking only to his horses and the wind. In 1883, he placed a simple ad, "Mountain man seeks cook, remote cabin, fair wages." What arrived at his door wasn't the grizzled frontiersman he expected, but a pregnant woman named Mary and her 8-year-old son Daniel, carrying nothing but hope and a worn leather satchel. Samuel's cabin sat in the unforgiving peaks, 2 days' ride from the nearest neighbor. He was a man who had forgotten how to share his table, his fire, or his heart. But Mary and Daniel were running from something, seeking refuge in his isolated world. Would this unlikely family teach a hardened mountain man that love could bloom even in the coldest wilderness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered peaks surrounding Samuel Creek's cabin, painting the wilderness in shades of gold and blue that would have taken a man's breath away if that man had been inclined to notice such things anymore. Samuel stood at his kitchen window, coffee cup warming his calloused hands, watching the steam rise from his mug and disappear into the crisp mountain air seeping through the cabin's weathered logs. At 42, Samuel had lived alone in these Colorado mountains for 15 years, ever since the fever took Sarah and their infant son during that terrible winter of 1868. He'd buried them both in the small cemetery behind the church in Cedar Falls, packed what little he could carry, and ridden into the wilderness with nothing but his grief and a determination to never again feel the crushing weight of loss that comes from loving someone more than life itself. His daily routine had become as predictable as the sunrise. Wake before dawn, tend to his horses, Buck, a sturdy bay gelding, and Belle, a gentle mare with kind eyes that reminded him too much of Sarah's. Feed the animals, check his traps, chop wood, hunt when necessary, and speak to no one except the occasional trader who ventured this high into the mountains seeking pelts or guidance through the treacherous passes. The cabin itself reflected its owner's practical, solitary existence, built from local pine and chinked with mud and moss. It consisted of 2 rooms, a main living area that served as kitchen, dining room, and parlor, and a small bedroom barely large enough for his narrow bed and a chest of drawers. The furnishings were sparse but well made. A sturdy table he'd crafted himself, 2 chairs, though he'd used only one for years, shelves lined with preserved food and basic supplies, and a stone fireplace that provided the cabin's only heat during the brutal mountain winters. Yet beneath his wool shirt, hanging from a thin leather cord against his chest, Samuel carried a secret that contradicted his chosen isolation, Sarah's wedding ring. He'd worn it there every day for 15 years, a golden reminder of what love had cost him and why he'd vowed never to risk such pain again. Sometimes, during the longest winter nights when the wind howled through the pines and loneliness sat heavier than the snow on his roof, he'd touch the ring through his shirt and remember her laugh, the way she hummed while kneading bread, how she'd rest her hand on her growing belly and speak to their unborn child about the future they were building together. Those memories came more frequently lately, stirring something restless in his chest that he tried to ignore. Perhaps it was simply the natural human need for companionship asserting itself after years of suppression. Perhaps it was the way the silence had begun to feel oppressive rather than peaceful. How conversations with Buck and Belle, one-sided though they were, had become longer and more elaborate. As if his mind were practicing for human interaction, it craved but feared. The decision to place the advertisement in the Rocky Mountain News had been purely practical, he told himself. Winter was approaching, and at his age, the constant demands of maintaining a mountain homestead were becoming more challenging. A cook would free him to focus on essential tasks like hunting, trapping, and preparing for the harsh months ahead. Someone who could manage the domestic duties while he ensured their survival in this unforgiving wilderness. He'd ridden to Cedar Falls on a supply run, the first time he'd entered the town in over a year. The place had grown since his last visit. New shops, more people, the bustle of progress that made him uncomfortable after so many years of solitude. At the newspaper office, he'd stood awkwardly before the editor's desk, struggling to find words for what he needed. Looking for hired help? The editor had asked, dipping his pen in ink with practiced efficiency. Cook, Samuel had managed, his voice rough from disuse in conversation. Remote cabin. Must not mind isolation. The editor had looked up at him then, taking in his weather-beaten appearance, the wariness in his eyes. The way Samuel seemed to take up as little space as possible, despite his broad shoulders and tall frame. Pay? Fair wages. Room and board included. Duration? Samuel had hesitated. How long did one hire a cook? How long before the arrangement became too complicated, too personal, too reminiscent of the domestic life he'd abandoned? To be determined, he'd finally said. The advertisement had run for 3 weeks. Samuel had ridden to town twice to check for responses, finding none the first time, and a single letter the second. The envelope had been addressed in a woman's careful handwriting, which had surprised him. He'd expected responses from grizzled frontiersmen, older men seeking shelter for the winter, perhaps former soldiers like himself who understood the value of solitude and the unspoken rules of keeping one's past private. But as he'd read the brief, polite letter by lamplight in his cabin, Sarah's ring warm against his chest, Samuel had found something unexpectedly appealing about the response. The writer, Mary, she'd signed simply, had mentioned her cooking experience, her willingness to work in remote conditions, and her immediate availability. The letter was well written, but contained none of the boastful claims or demands he'd expected. Instead, there was a quiet dignity to her words, a sense of someone who understood hardship and wasn't afraid of honest work. Most tellingly, she'd asked no questions about his reasons for living in such isolation or what had brought him to seek domestic help. That respect for privacy, that understanding that some stories were too painful to share with strangers, had decided him. He'd written back immediately, providing directions to his cabin and suggesting she arrive within the week if the position still interested her. He'd even included a small advance on wages, drawn from his modest savings, recognizing that anyone willing to travel so far into the mountains for work likely possessed limited resources. Now, 3 days past the earliest she could have arrived, Samuel found himself listening for hoofbeats, watching the mountain path that wound through the pines toward his door, and wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Not because he doubted the wisdom of hiring help, the practical benefits were undeniable, but because he'd grown comfortable in his solitude, safe in his self-imposed exile from the complications of human connection. What if this Mary person expected conversation? What if she was curious about his past, his reasons for living alone, the obvious signs that his cabin had once been intended for more than one person? The second chair at his table, the hooks by the door that could accommodate more than one coat, the way certain shelves sat empty as if waiting for someone else's belongings. These details might raise questions he had no desire to answer. Worse, what if her presence awakened longings he'd worked so hard to bury? The simple pleasure of sharing a meal, of hearing another human voice in the evening, of having someone to speak with about the small observations and thoughts that had accumulated in his mind over years of silence. These seemed like luxuries he couldn't afford, dangerous comforts that might make his chosen isolation feel less like safety and more like self-imposed prison. But it was too late for such doubts now. He'd sent his letter, and somewhere out there a woman named Mary was making her way through dangerous mountain terrain to reach him. The least he could do was ensure she arrived safely, treat her with respect, and maintain the boundaries necessary to protect them both from complications neither could afford. Samuel drained his coffee and set the cup aside, preparing to begin another day of solitary routine. Outside, Buck whinnied softly, and Belle answered with her own gentle sound. Soon he would need to bring them into the small stable he'd built adjacent to the cabin. check their hooves for ice, ensure they had adequate feed for the increasingly cold nights. It was a good life, he told himself, touching the ring beneath his shirt. Simple, predictable, free from the devastating surprises that love could bring. If this Mary worked out, if she could cook and keep house without trying to peer too deeply into his guarded heart, perhaps the arrangement would benefit them both. He had no way of knowing that by evening, his carefully ordered world would be forever changed by the arrival of two travelers whose need for refuge matched his own need for the family he'd never allowed himself to hope for again. The sound of approaching horses reached Samuel's ears just as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the western peaks. He paused in his wood-splitting, axe suspended mid-swing, and listened to the steady rhythm of hooves crunching through snow. Two horses, he determined, moving slowly up the winding path that led to his cabin. His visitor had arrived. Samuel set down his axe and brushed wood chips from his wool coat, suddenly conscious of his appearance in a way he hadn't been for years. When was the last time he'd trimmed his beard? His hair had grown past his collar, and his clothes, while clean and mended, bore the practical wear of a man who lived for function rather than fashion. The horses came into view first, a tired-looking mare carrying two riders and a pack horse laden with what appeared to be their entire worldly possessions. Samuel's breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene before him. The rider in front was indeed a woman, but she was clearly with child, her condition evident even beneath her heavy winter coat. Behind her sat a boy of perhaps 8 years, his thin arms wrapped around the woman's waist, his face bright with curiosity and exhaustion. This was not what he had expected. Not at all. The woman, Mary, he presumed, guided her horse to a stop near his cabin and looked down at him with eyes that held a mixture of hope, wariness, and bone-deep fatigue. She was younger than her letter had suggested, perhaps in her late 20s, with brown hair that had escaped its pins during the long ride, and a face that might have been quite pretty if not marked by the strain of hard travel and harder circumstances. "Mr. Creek?" Her voice was soft but steady, carrying the slight breathlessness of someone in her condition who had endured a difficult journey. "Yes, ma'am." Samuel stepped forward, his mind racing to process this unexpected development. "You'd be Mary, I reckon. Mary Walsh." She shifted carefully in her saddle, one hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. "This is Daniel." The boy peeked around her shoulder, offering Samuel a shy smile that transformed his thin face. Samuel found himself at a complete loss for words. His advertisement had been for a cook, a practical arrangement, nothing more. He'd envisioned a grizzled frontiersman, or perhaps a widow woman past her childbearing years, someone who could manage domestic duties without complications. He had certainly never imagined a pregnant woman and a child arriving at his door, carrying what appeared to be everything they owned, and looking at him with the desperate hope of people who had nowhere else to go. He began, then stopped, unsure how to voice his confusion without seeming unwelcoming. The boy's eyes were wide with wonder as he took in the cabin, the mountains, the vast wilderness that surrounded them. There was something achingly familiar about that expression of innocent curiosity, something that tugged at memories Samuel preferred to keep buried. Mary seemed to sense his discomfort. Her shoulders squared slightly, and she lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "I understand this might not be what you expected, Mr. Creek. If you've changed your mind about needing help, we can—" "No," Samuel interrupted, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. Something about her assumption that he would turn them away, the resigned way she'd prepared for rejection, stirred an unexpected protectiveness in his chest. "That is, you've come a long way. Why don't you come inside, warm yourselves by the fire? We can talk." Relief flickered across Mary's face, quickly masked, but not before Samuel caught it. Whatever circumstances had brought her to his remote mountain cabin, they had not been easy ones. "Daniel, can you help me down?" she asked the boy, who immediately scrambled from the horse with the quick agility of youth. Samuel stepped forward, offering his hand to help her dismount. Her fingers were cold even through her worn gloves, and he could feel the slight tremor that spoke of exhaustion and strain. She was further along in her pregnancy than he'd initially realized, perhaps 6 or 7 months. He estimated, though his knowledge of such matters was admittedly limited. "Careful now," he murmured, steadying her as she found her footing in the snow. "Thank you." Mary's voice was quiet, but there was genuine gratitude in it. Daniel bounced excitedly in the snow, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Is this really where you live? All by yourself? Do you see bears, Indians? Have you ever been in a gunfight?" "Daniel," Mary said gently, a note of fond exasperation in her voice. "Remember your manners." "Sorry, ma'am." The boy ducked his head, but continued to gaze around with fascination. Samuel found himself almost smiling, an expression that felt foreign after so many years. "No gunfights lately," he told Daniel solemnly. "But I have seen bears, and the Ute people pass through sometimes. They're neighbors, same as anyone else." Inside her worn leather satchel, Mary carried something precious, a small Bible bound in cracked leather, its pages yellow with age and handling. Between the pages, pressed flowers marked significant passages, and tucked into the back cover were 2 small photographs, one of a young woman who bore a strong resemblance to Mary, and another of a stern-faced man holding a baby. These were the only physical reminders she had of the family she'd lost, and the family she was trying to protect. "Let's get you both inside," Samuel said, shouldering one of their bags before Mary could protest. "It'll be full dark soon, and the temperature drops considerable once the sun's gone." The cabin felt different with 3 people in it, smaller but somehow more alive. Samuel busied himself building up the fire, while Mary and Daniel shed their coats and looked around with obvious exhaustion and relief. The boy's eyes were immediately drawn to Samuel's few personal possessions: a rifle mounted above the fireplace, a collection of hand tools arranged neatly on shelves, books that suggested their owner was more educated than his isolated existence might indicate. "Sit yourselves down," Samuel gestured to the chairs near the fire. "I'll put some coffee on. And there's stew left from yesterday, nothing fancy, but it's warm and filling." Mary sank into one of the chairs with obvious relief, one hand rubbing her lower back. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Creek. We haven't had a proper meal in 2 days." The casual way she mentioned their hardship, as if going without food was simply a fact to be endured rather than a catastrophe to be lamented, told Samuel more about their circumstances than any detailed explanation could have. These weren't people who had simply fallen on temporary hard times. They were refugees from something, running toward his remote sanctuary, not out of choice but out of necessity. As he prepared the simple meal, Samuel found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guests. Daniel had discovered the small collection of books on Samuel's shelf and was examining them with the reverent curiosity of a child who understood the value of the written word. Mary sat quietly, her hands folded over her belly, watching her boy with such tenderness that it made Samuel's chest tighten with recognition. He had seen that exact expression on Sarah's face when she watched their unborn child move within her womb, had heard that same gentle fondness in her voice when she spoke to the baby she would never hold. The parallel was so acute it took him a moment to catch his breath. "Ma'am," Daniel said suddenly, looking up from a volume of Shakespeare that Samuel had carried with him since his youth, "this man has Hamlet." "The whole thing," Mary smiled, the first genuine smile Samuel had seen from her. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." "What do you say to Mr. Creek?" "Thank you for letting me look at your books, sir. I can read, and I'm very careful." "You're welcome to them," Samuel found himself saying. "Been a while since anyone showed interest in Shakespeare up here." The boy's face lit up with such joy that Samuel felt something long frozen shift in his chest. When had he last seen such simple, uncomplicated happiness? When had his own world been large enough to include the wonder of a child, discovering new books, new possibilities? "Daniel loves to read," Mary explained softly. "His father taught him letters before—" She stopped abruptly, her expression closing off. Before what? Samuel wondered, but he recognized the look of someone who had revealed more than intended. He'd worn that same expression many times when memories of Sarah threatened to spill into conversation with strangers. "Reading's a good skill to have," Samuel said simply, ladling stew into bowls. "Especially up here where entertainment's scarce." As they ate by firelight, the cabin filled with the soft sounds of domestic comfort Samuel had forgotten he missed. The gentle scrape of spoons against bowls, the satisfied sighs of people enjoying warm food after hardship, the quiet murmur of conversation that had nothing to do with survival or solitude. Daniel peppered him with questions about mountain life, each answer leading to 3 more inquiries delivered with the boundless curiosity of childhood. Mary ate sparingly but gratefully, occasionally interjecting gentle corrections to her son's manners or adding context to his more outlandish theories about frontier living. "Are you really all alone up here?" Daniel asked as they finished their meal. "Don't you get scared or lonesome?" "Daniel," Mary warned softly. "It's all right," Samuel said, though the question hit closer to home than the boy could know. "A man gets used to his own company. And the mountains, they're good companions if you know how to listen to them. But don't you want a family?" The question was asked with the blunt innocence of childhood, but it hung in the air like a physical presence. Samuel felt Mary's eyes on him, saw the way she tensed slightly as if preparing to apologize for her son's directness. But something in the boy's earnest expression, in the genuine concern behind the question, made Samuel want to answer honestly. "I had a family once," he said quietly. "Sometimes life takes things away from you, and you learn to live different than you planned." Daniel considered this with the seriousness children brought to adult mysteries. "That's sad. But maybe," he glanced at his mother, then back at Samuel, "maybe sometimes life gives you new things too." The words hung between them, simple and profound in the way that only truth spoken by children could be. Samuel found himself looking at Mary, really looking at her for the first time since she'd arrived. Behind the exhaustion and weariness, he saw strength, intelligence, and something else, a fierce protectiveness that reminded him of a she-wolf guarding her cubs. Whatever had brought her to his door, whatever circumstances had driven a pregnant woman and a child into the wilderness seeking shelter with a stranger, she had done it for Daniel. That much was clear in every glance she gave the boy, every gentle correction, every way she unconsciously positioned herself between him and potential harm. "We should settle you both for the night," Samuel said, rising from the table. "It's been a long day and morning comes early up here." As he prepared makeshift sleeping arrangements, his own bed for Mary, bedrolls by the fire for himself and Daniel, Samuel realized that his carefully ordered world had already begun to change. The cabin felt different with voices other than his own, echoing off the walls, with the rustle of unfamiliar clothing and the soft breathing of people who trusted him enough to sleep under his roof. Standing in the doorway of his bedroom, watching Mary settle Daniel for the night with the practiced movements of motherhood, Samuel touched the ring beneath his shirt and wondered what Sarah would have thought of this unexpected turn of events. Would she have welcomed these strangers as he found himself doing? Would she have seen, as he was beginning to see, that sometimes rescue came in forms you never expected? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows and promising a cold night ahead. But inside, warmed by fire and the unfamiliar comfort of human companionship, Samuel found himself thinking that perhaps Daniel was right. Perhaps sometimes life did give you new things, even when you thought you were too broken to receive them. Samuel woke before dawn, as was his habit, but found himself lying still in his bedroll by the dying fire rather than immediately rising to begin his daily routine. The cabin held sounds he hadn't heard in 15 years, the soft, rhythmic breathing of a sleeping child and the gentle sighs of a woman finding rest after hardship. Daniel had kicked off his blankets during the night, and Mary had risen sometime in the darkness to cover him again, her movements careful and quiet in deference to their host. When he finally rose and stepped outside to tend the horses, Samuel discovered that several inches of fresh snow had fallen during the night. transforming the already pristine landscape into something that looked like God's own handiwork. The silence was profound, broken only by the soft whicker of Buck and Bell as they greeted him from their shelter. "Morning to you too," he murmured to the horses, checking their water and feed with the automatic motions of long practice. But his mind was elsewhere, turning over the implications of his situation. Two people now depended on his hospitality and protection, one of them a child, and the other a woman heavy with child. The responsibility felt both terrifying and strangely welcome when he returned to the cabin, carrying fresh water from the creek and an armload of split wood. He found Mary already awake and moving carefully around the kitchen area. She had somehow managed to make coffee without waking Daniel, and the rich aroma filled the cabin with domestic comfort. "You didn't need to," Samuel began. "It's the least I can do." Mary interrupted gently, pouring him a cup. "You've been more than kind to strangers." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two people unaccustomed to sharing space, trying to navigate the delicate courtesies of unexpected cohabitation. Samuel found himself noticing details he'd missed the night before. The way Mary's brown hair caught the firelight, the careful way she moved to accommodate her pregnancy, the quick intelligence in her eyes as she assessed her surroundings. "About yesterday," Mary said quietly, glancing toward the still sleeping Daniel. "I should explain—" "No need," Samuel said quickly. "Your business is your own." But Mary shook her head. "You have a right to know what you're taking on. Daniel isn't—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "He's my nephew, my sister's boy. She died giving birth to him 8 years ago, and I've raised him since." The simple statement carried layers of meaning Samuel recognized. Another woman who had lost family, who had taken on responsibilities beyond her years, who understood the weight of caring for those who couldn't care for themselves. "His father?" Samuel asked gently. Mary's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Not a good man. Daniel's better off without him, but legally—" She stopped, clearly unwilling to elaborate. Samuel nodded, understanding the unspoken message. Whatever had brought them to his door involved running from Daniel's father, a man with legal claims but questionable character. The boy's innocent questions about books and bears suddenly took on deeper significance. A child seeking wonder in a world that had likely shown him too much uncertainty. Daniel stirred then, sitting up with the quick alertness of childhood and looking around the cabin as if remembering where he was. His face broke into a grin when he saw Samuel. "Good morning, Mr. Creek. Is it always this quiet up here?" At home, there were always sounds, people shouting, horses, wagons. But here it's like the whole world is sleeping. "Mountains keep their own schedule," Samuel replied, surprised by how easily conversation came with the boy. "Most folks never learn to hear the quiet sounds. Wind in the pines, creek running under ice, animals moving through the forest." "Can you teach me?" Daniel asked eagerly, already reaching for his boots. Mary intercepted him gently. "Breakfast first, sweetheart. And we need to discuss our arrangements with Mr. Creek." As they sat around Samuel's small table, sharing a simple meal of porridge and preserved fruit, Samuel found himself studying his guests more carefully. Daniel ate with the focused attention of a child who had known hunger, while Mary picked at her food despite her obvious need for nourishment. Both carried themselves with a wariness that spoke of recent hardship and the constant readiness to move on if necessary. Hidden in Daniel's small bundle of possessions was a wooden horse, carved with obvious care and polished smooth by small hands. The toy was simple but beautifully crafted, its proportions perfect and its expression somehow capturing the spirit of a real animal. Samuel noticed it when Daniel carefully unwrapped his few belongings, handling the horse with the reverence children reserved for their most precious treasures. "That's a fine piece of carving," Samuel observed. Nodding toward the toy, Daniel's face lit up with pride. "My papa made it for me before he went away." The boy's expression grew more complex. "He wasn't my real papa, but he was good to us. He taught me to read and how to whittle and told me stories about horses and cowboys." Mary's face tightened slightly, and Samuel caught the quick exchange of glances between them. Another piece of their story. A stepfather who had been kind, who had perhaps died or been forced to leave, creating the circumstances that had driven them to seek sanctuary with a stranger. "He sounds like a good man," Samuel said simply. "He was," Daniel replied, cradling the wooden horse. "He said someday I'd have a real horse of my own, and I'd ride all through the mountains and see everything there was to see." The wistful longing in the boy's voice struck Samuel unexpectedly. Here was a child who had already lost too much, who carried his few possessions and fewer certainties with the resilience of someone much older. Yet underneath the premature gravity, Daniel retained the essential optimism of youth, the belief that life held adventures and possibilities beyond his current circumstances. "Would you like to meet Buck and Belle?" Samuel found himself asking. "They're my horses." "Buck's getting on in years, but he's steady. Belle's got a gentle temperament, good with children." Daniel's face transformed with such joy that Samuel felt something shift in his chest. When had he last been the source of such uncomplicated happiness? When had his own actions brought that particular light to a child's eyes? "Could I really? I mean, if Aunt Mary says it's all right." Mary looked between Samuel and Daniel, clearly reading the longing in her nephew's face and the unexpected kindness in their host's offer. "If Mr. Creek is sure it's no trouble at all," Samuel said, and meant it. The next hour passed in a way Samuel hadn't experienced in 15 years. He found himself explaining the basics of horse care to an eager apprentice, showing Daniel how to approach the animals with respect and confidence. Watching the boy's face light up as Buck nuzzled his small hand, seeking treats. Daniel was a natural with the horses, moving with instinctive understanding and speaking to them in the gentle tones Samuel remembered using with animals as a child. Belle in particular seemed drawn to the boy, lowering her great head so he could stroke her nose and whickering softly when he whispered secrets into her ears. "She likes you," Samuel observed, genuinely impressed by the connection. "I think she's lonesome too," Daniel said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "Animals get lonesome same as people, don't they?" The observation hit Samuel with unexpected force. How long had it been since someone had looked at his life with such clear eyes and seen not the noble isolation he told himself he preferred, but simple loneliness? How long since anyone had suggested that his self-imposed exile might be as much about fear as about wisdom? Meanwhile, Mary had quietly taken stock of the cabin's domestic arrangements and begun making subtle improvements that spoke of experience managing a household under difficult circumstances. She reorganized the pantry with practiced efficiency, mended a tear in one of Samuel's shirts that he'd been meaning to fix for months, and prepared a midday meal that somehow transformed his basic supplies into something that tasted like comfort itself. "You don't need to—" Samuel started to protest when he discovered her working. "I do, actually," Mary replied firmly but kindly. "You're providing shelter and safety for us. The least I can do is earn my keep." There was pride in her voice, the dignity of someone who had learned to contribute wherever she found herself, rather than accepting charity. Samuel recognized the sentiment. He'd felt the same way after Sarah's death, when well-meaning neighbors had tried to help him through his grief with casseroles and offers of assistance he'd been too proud to accept. As the day progressed, Samuel found himself settling into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Having others in his space required adjustments. Shared meals meant conversation. Daniel's presence meant moderating his language and considering safety in new ways. Mary's condition meant ensuring adequate warmth and comfort. Yet, rather than feeling crowded or intruded upon, Samuel discovered something he hadn't expected: the simple pleasure of being useful to people who needed him. When Daniel peppered him with questions about wildlife and weather patterns, Samuel found himself drawing on knowledge he'd accumulated during his years alone, but had never shared with anyone. When Mary struggled with a heavy pot due to her pregnancy, he stepped in without thinking, their movements around the kitchen becoming a careful dance of mutual consideration. By evening, as they sat around the fire after another simple but satisfying meal, Samuel realized that his cabin had begun to feel like something he'd almost forgotten it could be. A home rather than merely a shelter. The addition of voices and laughter, of Daniel's excited chatter and Mary's gentle responses, had transformed the space into something warmer and more alive than it had been in 15 years. "Mr. Creek," Daniel said sleepily from his bedroll, already fighting to keep his eyes open. "Tomorrow can you show me how to split wood? I want to help with the chores." "We'll see," Samuel replied, though his tone suggested agreement. "Wood splitting takes practice, and the axes are heavy." "I'm stronger than I look," Daniel insisted with the confidence of childhood, "and I learn fast. Aunt Mary says I'm good with my hands like my papa was." As the boy drifted off to sleep, his wooden horse clutched securely in his arms, Samuel caught Mary watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was gratitude there, certainly, but also something deeper, a recognition of kindness freely given, of patience extended to a child who had seen too little of both. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for making him feel welcome, for not treating us like charity cases." "He's a good boy," Samuel replied, surprised by the roughness in his own voice. "You've done well by him." Mary's smile was soft but sad. "I've tried, but a boy needs more than I can give him. He needs—" She gestured vaguely, searching for words. "He needs someone to teach him how to be a man, someone to show him that men can be gentle and kind, as well as strong." The words hung between them, carrying implications neither was ready to address directly. But Samuel understood what she was saying, just as he was beginning to understand why finding his remote cabin might have felt like more than simple employment opportunity to a woman protecting a child from an unfit father. Outside, the wind had picked up again, promising another cold night. But inside the cabin, warmed by fire and the unexpected comfort of companionship, Samuel found himself thinking that perhaps some risks were worth taking, particularly when they came disguised as blessings he'd been too afraid to hope for. The routine they established over the following week felt as natural as if they'd been living together for months rather than days. Samuel woke before dawn to tend the animals and check his trap lines, returning to find Mary already preparing breakfast with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to managing a household. Daniel would emerge from sleep gradually, eager to help with morning chores and full of questions about everything from the way frost formed on the windows to the habits of the mountain wildlife Samuel tracked. What surprised Samuel most was how easily he adapted to their presence. He'd expected to feel crowded, restless, perhaps even resentful of the intrusion into his carefully ordered solitude. Instead, he discovered that sharing his space had awakened parts of himself he'd thought permanently dormant. The teacher who enjoyed explaining the intricacies of mountain survival, the protector who found satisfaction in ensuring others' comfort and safety, the companion who had missed the simple pleasure of conversation more than he'd realized. During the long evenings by the fire, as snow continued to fall and the world outside grew increasingly isolated, Samuel found himself talking more than he had in years. Daniel's curiosity proved inexhaustible, and his questions drew stories from Samuel that he hadn't shared with anyone. Tales of wildlife encounters, severe weather survival, the small victories and daily challenges of mountain living. "Were you ever a soldier, Mr. Creek?" Daniel asked one evening, his sharp eyes having noticed details that escaped most adults. The way Samuel moved with unconscious precision, his automatic assessment of sight lines and defensive positions, the military bearing that 15 years of isolation hadn't entirely erased. Samuel paused in his whittling a piece of pine that was slowly taking the shape of a small bird under his careful knife work. The question touched on memories he rarely allowed himself to examine, but something about Daniel's earnest curiosity and Mary's quiet attention made evasion feel unnecessarily cruel. "I was," he admitted quietly. "Long time ago, different life." "In the war?" Daniel's eyes widened with the fascination children held for stories of adventure and heroism. "Yes," Samuel said simply, not elaborating on which war or what he'd seen or done. Some stories were too heavy for young ears, some memories too sharp even after years of careful burial, but Daniel seemed to sense the weight behind the simple admission. Rather than pressing for dramatic details, he asked, "Is that where you learned to be so careful about everything? Aunt Mary says you think like someone who's used to watching for trouble." The observation startled Samuel with its accuracy. He glanced at Mary, who had been quietly mending one of Daniel's shirts by firelight, and caught her watching him with an expression of gentle understanding. She knew something about men who carried wartime memories, who moved through the world with heightened awareness of potential dangers. "Habit," Samuel said finally. "Some habits serve you well in the mountains." Mary's smile was small but knowing. "Good habits to have when you're responsible for others," she said softly. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Samuel found himself thinking about Mary's comment throughout the evening. When had he begun thinking of himself as responsible for their welfare? When had their temporary arrangement started feeling less like charity and more like family? The shift in his thinking became more apparent as he worked on a project during the late-night hours when Mary and Daniel slept. Using pine from his own land and tools, worn smooth by years of use, Samuel had begun crafting a small cradle. He told himself it was purely practical. Mary would need somewhere safe for the baby when it arrived, and winter was no time to be searching for suitable furniture. But late at night, by lamplight, as he shaped each piece with careful attention to detail, Samuel knew the truth was more complex. He was investing in their future, not just their immediate survival or temporary comfort, but their long-term place in his life. Each careful joint and smooth surface represented hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 15 years. Hope for continuity, for family, for the possibility that his cabin might once again ring with the sounds of childhood and new life. The cradle took shape slowly, deliberately, crafted with the same attention to detail he'd once brought to everything he'd made for Sarah. But where his wife's furniture had been born from confident expectation of shared future, this piece carried the tentative hope of a man learning to risk his heart again. During the days, Daniel proved himself an eager and capable assistant. Despite his small size, he approached every task with determination and surprising competence. Samuel taught him to split kindling with a small hatchet, how to read animal, tracks in the snow, the basics of maintaining and loading the rifles that might be necessary for protection or hunting. "He's never had a man take such interest in teaching him," Mary confided to Samuel one afternoon as they watched Daniel practice the knots Samuel had shown him. His real father, Daniel's father, wasn't much for patience or instruction. "And Thomas, my husband, he tried," but she stopped herself, as she often did when memories of their previous life threatened to intrude into their present sanctuary. But Samuel was learning to read the pauses, the careful omissions, the way Mary chose her words to reveal as little as possible about what they'd fled. "The boy's smart," Samuel said, watching Daniel work with focused concentration. "Good hands, good instincts. Someone taught him well before he got here." Mary's smile was soft with pride and sorrow. "His mother, my sister, she was the smartest person I ever knew. She made sure he learned to read, taught him numbers, insisted on proper manners even when—" Another pause, another careful editing of painful history. "I've tried to continue what she started." "You've done well by him," Samuel said, and meant it. Daniel's fundamental decency, his curiosity and resilience, spoke of care and attention that had persevered despite difficult circumstances. As the days passed, Samuel found himself watching Mary with growing awareness of the woman behind the careful defenses. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 27 or 28, but carried herself with the gravity of someone who had shouldered adult responsibilities early in life. Her intelligence was evident in the way she organized their domestic arrangements, her humor gentle but real when Daniel's antics amused her. her strength apparent in everything from the way she managed her pregnancy to her determination to contribute meaningfully to their shared household. More than once, Samuel caught himself comparing her to Sarah, not in appearance, for they looked nothing alike, but in the essential qualities that made a woman capable of building a life in difficult circumstances. Mary possessed the same practical competence, the same gift for creating comfort from limited resources, the same fierce protectiveness toward those she loved. But where Sarah had been sunny and optimistic, quick to laugh and assume the best of people, Mary carried shadows that spoke of harder lessons learned. She moved through the world with careful attention to potential threats, watched strangers with wariness that had been earned through experience, kept careful boundaries around information that might put her or Daniel at risk. It was this combination of strength and vulnerability that Samuel found himself thinking about during the quiet hours of night watch, when the wind howled around the cabin and he sat by the dying fire with his rifle across his knees, listening for sounds that didn't belong in the mountain darkness. Someone had hurt this woman and the boy she protected. Someone had driven them from their home into the dangerous uncertainty of winter travel to a stranger's cabin. The knowledge stirred something protective in Samuel that had nothing to do with simple hospitality and everything to do with the growing attachment he was trying not to acknowledge. Late one evening, as they sat by the fire after Daniel had fallen asleep, Mary surprised him by breaking their companionable silence with a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Why did you really place that advertisement, Mr. Creek?" Samuel looked up from the piece of leather he'd been working on, a new bridle for Belle that would replace her worn and cracked tack. The question was asked gently, but he heard the deeper curiosity behind it, the intelligence that had been observing and drawing conclusions about his motivations. "Told you," he said carefully. "Needed help with domestic arrangements. Cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing." Mary's smile was knowing. "A man who's lived alone as long as you have learned to manage those things for himself. Your cabin was already clean and well organized when we arrived. Your cooking might be simple, but it's adequate. And you've got enough supplies laid by to last through 2 winters, not one." She paused, studying his face in the firelight. "I think you were lonely, Mr. Creek. I think you placed that advertisement because you missed having people to talk to care for, to share your life with. And I think you're a better man than you want anyone to know." The accuracy of her assessment left Samuel momentarily speechless. How had she seen through his carefully constructed rationales to the simple, vulnerable truth beneath? How had she recognized the loneliness he'd worked so hard to deny even to himself? "Mary," he began, then stopped, unsure how to respond to such gentle honesty. "It's all right," she said softly. "I understand about loneliness, about missing the family you've lost and being afraid to hope for new family to replace them." The words hung between them, heavy with shared understanding and carefully unspoken implications. Samuel found himself looking at this woman, really looking at her, and seeing not just a temporary guest or even a hired hand, but someone who understood loss and healing, who recognized the courage required to open a guarded heart to new possibilities. Outside, the wind continued its restless song through the pines, but inside the cabin, surrounded by the gentle sounds of home, Daniel's quiet breathing, Mary's soft presence, the crackle of the fire that warmed them all, Samuel allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to let these people stay, not just through the winter, but permanently. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as he watched Mary's gentle hands rest protectively on her unborn child and felt the unfamiliar comfort of belonging to something larger than his own careful solitude, Samuel found himself thinking that perhaps the greatest courage wasn't in facing the wilderness alone, but in admitting that some gifts were worth the risk of accepting them. 3 weeks into their arrangement, a blizzard descended on the mountains with the sudden ferocity that marked true winter's arrival. For 2 days, snow fell so heavily that stepping outside the cabin meant risking disorientation and death, even for someone as experienced as Samuel. The wind howled with supernatural force, driving snow horizontally past the windows and piling drifts against the cabin walls that reached nearly to the eaves. Forced into close quarters by the storm's fury, the three of them discovered new depths to their developing relationships. Samuel found himself sharing stories he'd kept locked away for 15 years, drawn out by Daniel's endless curiosity and Mary's gentle encouragement. As the boy sat cross-legged by the fire, whittling his own piece of wood with the small knife Samuel had given him, Samuel began to speak of Sarah. "She was about your aunt's age when we married," he said, his voice soft with memory. "Had the prettiest laugh you ever heard, and she could make a feast out of nothing but beans and hope." Mary looked up from the mending in her lap, understanding the significance of his sharing these memories. Daniel listened with the grave attention children gave to adult confidences, sensing the weight of trust being offered. "What happened to her?" Daniel asked with the directness of youth. Samuel was quiet for so long that the boy began to fidget, perhaps regretting his boldness. But when Samuel finally spoke, his voice was steady, though touched with old grief. "Fever took her and our baby. Winter of '68, worst winter anyone could remember, and by the time I could get down the mountain for a doctor, it was too late for both of them." Mary's hands stilled on her sewing. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "That must have been unbearable." "Thought it was," Samuel admitted. "Thought I was done with caring about anyone, done with the risk of losing what mattered most." He looked between Mary and Daniel, his meaning clear. Funny how life has other plans sometimes. In the growing intimacy forced by the storm, Mary began to share pieces of her own story. Not the full truth, that would come later, but enough to help Samuel understand the shadows that sometimes crossed her face, the way she startled at unexpected sounds, the careful way she guarded information about their past. "My sister Ellen was 5 years older than me," Mary said one evening as they sat by the fire, the storm still raging outside. "When our parents died, she became more mother than sister. She married young to a man who seemed kind at first." Mary's hand moved unconsciously to her belly. But kindness and weakness can look similar from a distance. Daniel had grown quiet during these conversations, old enough to understand that the adults were sharing important truths, but young enough to be made uncomfortable by references to the painful past they'd all fled. Samuel, noticing the boy's discomfort, began to include him more directly in the conversations. "Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman," Samuel told Daniel. "Takes wisdom to make sure a boy learns reading and proper behavior, even when times are hard. She used to tell me stories," Daniel said, his face brightening, "about knights and dragons and brave people who did the right thing even when it was scary." Hidden in Mary's worn leather Bible, pressed between the pages that contained her favorite verses, were dried flowers that told a story of love and loss. Wild flowers from Ellen's wedding day, pressed carefully between tissue paper. A sprig of lavender from the herb garden they'd planted together. A single rose from Ellen's funeral, the last tangible connection to the sister who had raised her and the life they'd built together before everything went wrong. Samuel discovered the flowers by accident when the Bible fell open, as Mary reached for something else. The carefully preserved blossoms spoke of sentiment and remembrance, of someone who honored memory even while building new life. "Your sister?" he asked gently, noting the careful way Mary gathered the scattered petals. Mary nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "I keep them to remember the good times before everything changed." Ellen loved flowers, loved making things beautiful even when we had so little. The storm finally broke on the third day, leaving them in a world transformed by snow and silence. The drifts reached above Samuel's waist in places, and the familiar landscape had been sculpted into something alien and beautiful. But the enforced intimacy of the storm had changed something fundamental between the three of them. Where before they had been polite strangers sharing space, now they moved with the unconscious coordination of family. Mary anticipated Samuel's needs in the kitchen. Daniel sought his approval for small accomplishments, and Samuel found himself planning activities that would include and delight them both. "We'll need to dig out the path to the stable," Samuel announced as they surveyed the storm's aftermath. "And check on Buck and Belle. Daniel, you strong enough to help with a shovel?" "Yes, sir!" Daniel's enthusiasm for any task that let him work alongside Samuel had only grown during their weeks together. As they worked to clear the snow, Samuel found himself teaching Daniel not just the mechanics of winter survival, but the philosophy behind it. "Up here, you never know when the next storm might trap you for days," he explained as they shoveled. "So you always prepare like your life depends on it, because it does. Is that why you have so much food stored up?" Daniel asked, pausing to catch his breath. "Partly, but also because—" Samuel stopped himself, realizing he'd been about to say, "because now I have people depending on me." The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Mary, watching from the cabin window as Samuel patiently guided Daniel through the work, found herself thinking about the future in ways she'd been afraid to consider. When she'd first arrived at Samuel's cabin, it had been pure desperation, a last refuge for her and Daniel when all other options had been exhausted. But watching him with her nephew, seeing the careful kindness he showed to a boy who hungered for masculine guidance, Mary began to allow herself to hope for something more permanent. That evening, as they sat around the fire, sharing a dinner of venison stew and cornbread Mary had somehow coaxed from Samuel's basic supplies, Daniel made an announcement that surprised them both. "I've been thinking," he said, with the seriousness children brought to important decisions. "Instead of calling you Mr. Creek all the time, could I call you Uncle Samuel? I mean, if that's all right with you." Samuel felt something tight in his chest loosen at the boy's words. Uncle Samuel. It wasn't father. Daniel was too loyal to his real father's memory for that, but it was family. It was belonging. It was a place in the boy's world that meant more than Samuel had realized he wanted. "I'd be honored," Samuel said, his voice rougher than usual. Mary watched this exchange with emotions too complex to name. Gratitude, certainly, for Samuel's kindness to Daniel. Relief that her nephew was finding the stable male influence he'd been missing. But underneath those surface feelings was something deeper and more frightening. The recognition that she was falling in love with this quiet, careful man who had opened his home and heart to strangers. Later that night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, Mary and Samuel found themselves talking by the dying fire with an intimacy that had been building through weeks of shared domesticity and the storm's enforced closeness. "He needs this," Mary said quietly, watching Daniel sleep peacefully for perhaps the first time since they'd begun their flight. "He needs someone like you, someone strong and kind and patient. What about what you need?" Samuel asked gently. The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Mary was quiet for so long that Samuel began to think she wouldn't answer. "I need," she said finally, "to know that Daniel will be safe. That he'll grow up somewhere he can learn to be a good man, somewhere he won't have to be afraid." She paused, then added more softly, "I need to stop running." Samuel understood what she wasn't saying, that safety and stability required more than just temporary shelter. That the growing bond between them was as much about necessity as affection, as much about survival as love. But understanding the practical aspects of their situation didn't diminish the reality of what was happening between them. "Mary," he said carefully, "when spring comes, when the passes open up again, what will you do?" It was the question that had been hanging over all of them, the uncertainty that made their current happiness feel fragile and temporary. Mary looked at him for a long moment, seeing in his face the same mixture of hope and fear she felt in her own heart. "I don't know," she admitted. "For so long, I've only been able to think one day ahead, one safe place at a time. I haven't dared plan for the future. What if you could?" Samuel asked quietly. "What if you had someplace safe enough to make plans, to think about what you really wanted, instead of just what you needed to survive?" The conversation was interrupted by Daniel, stirring in his sleep, murmuring something about horses and snow before settling back into peaceful rest. But the seeds of possibility had been planted, the careful beginning of discussions that would reshape all their futures. Outside, the mountain night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the thin air. Inside the cabin, three people who had found each other in desperate circumstances began to dream of something more permanent, something that looked less like refuge and more like home. The morning after their fireside conversation found Samuel at his workbench before dawn, carefully shaping a piece of iron he'd been heating and reheating in his forge. The metal glowed red-hot in the dim light, malleable under his experienced hands as he formed it into a perfect circle. He'd been working on this project in secret for over a week, using the skills he'd learned as a young man, when metalworking was necessity rather than sentiment. A wedding band. Simple, strong, designed to last a lifetime on the hand of a woman who deserved far better than the hardship life had given her so far. Samuel wasn't sure when he'd made the decision to ask Mary to marry him. Perhaps it had been forming gradually through weeks of shared domesticity, or perhaps it had crystallized during the storm, when he'd realized how empty his cabin would feel without her laughter and Daniel's endless questions. The practical reasons were obvious. Mary needed protection, legal and social, especially with a child coming. Daniel needed a father figure and the stability of a permanent home. Samuel was beginning to admit that his needs went far beyond simple companionship. He was falling in love with this quiet, strong woman who had brought light back into his carefully darkened world. But beneath the practical considerations lay deeper truths that Samuel was only beginning to acknowledge. Mary made him want to be the man he'd been before grief had carved away his capacity for hope. In her eyes, he saw reflected not the hermit he'd become, but the protector, provider and partner he'd always been meant to be. When Mary emerged from the cabin to milk their cow, a task she'd taken over despite Samuel's protests, she found him banking the forge fire with unusual attention to concealing his work. Up early this morning, she observed, though her tone held curiosity rather than suspicion. Couldn't sleep, Samuel replied truthfully. Thought I'd get some work done. Mary studied his face with the perceptive intelligence he'd come to expect from her. She knew he was working on something he didn't want her to see, but rather than prying, she simply nodded and went about her morning tasks with the grace she brought to everything. This quality of hers, the ability to respect boundaries while offering quiet support, was one of the things Samuel had grown to love. About Mary, she never pushed for information or intimacy before it was freely offered, but her presence somehow made sharing feel safe in ways he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. As the weeks passed and Mary's pregnancy advanced, Samuel found himself torn between growing joy and increasing anxiety. The baby was due sometime in late winter or early spring, and the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride through mountain passes that would be impassable until the snow melted. Samuel had assisted with animal births countless times, but the thought of being responsible for Mary's safety during childbirth filled him with the same terror he'd felt watching Sarah struggle through labor 15 years ago. Women have been having babies without doctors for thousands of years, Mary reminded him gently when she caught him staring at his medical supplies with obvious concern. I'm strong, and I've helped with births before. We'll manage. But Samuel had already begun making plans that went far beyond simply managing. He'd sent word to the Henderson family, their nearest neighbors 20 miles away, asking Ruth Henderson to consider spending the last weeks of Mary's pregnancy at their cabin. Ruth had birthed 6 children of her own and served as midwife for half the women in the territory. If anyone could ensure Mary's safety, it would be Ruth. The response came back with Jim Henderson when he made his monthly supply run to town. Ruth would come, bringing her medical kit and experience, but not until the weather broke enough for safe travel. In the meantime, Samuel would need to prepare for the possibility of handling the birth himself. She's a good woman, your Mary, Jim told Samuel as they shared coffee and discussed the arrangements. Ruth took quite a shine to her when they met at the trading post last month. Says she's got good sense and isn't given to hysterics. "She's not my Mary," Samuel protested automatically, though the words felt false even as he spoke them. Jim's knowing smile suggested he wasn't fooled by the denial. "Son, I've been married 32 years, and I know the look of a man who's found his match. Question is, what are you planning to do about it?" The directness of the question caught Samuel off guard. Jim Henderson was known for his blunt speech and practical wisdom, qualities that had made him a respected figure in their scattered mountain community. If anyone could offer useful advice about Samuel's complicated situation, it would be Jim. "It's not that simple," Samuel said carefully. "She's got complications in her past. Legal troubles, maybe. And there's the boy to consider." "Boy seems happy enough to me," Jim observed. "And as for legal troubles, well, sometimes a woman's got to make hard choices to protect what matters most. Doesn't make her a bad person, just makes her someone who understands that law and justice aren't always the same thing." Jim's casual acceptance of Mary's mysterious past surprised Samuel. He'd expected more questions, more concern about harboring someone who might be running from legal authorities. "How do you know she's running from something?" Samuel asked. "Same way I know you were a soldier, and that whatever you saw in the war still keeps you awake some nights," Jim replied matter-of-factly. "Some things leave marks on a person. Doesn't mean they're not worth caring about." That evening, as Samuel helped Daniel with his reading lessons while Mary prepared dinner, he found himself thinking about Jim's words. The domestic scene felt so natural, so right, that it was easy to forget the uncertainty that shadowed their future. Daniel read haltingly but persistently from a collection of folk tales, occasionally asking for help with difficult words, while Mary hummed softly as she worked at the stove. "Uncle Samuel," Daniel said suddenly, looking up from his book, "do you think we could stay here forever? I mean, if Aunt Mary wanted to?" The question hung in the air, loaded with hope and uncertainty. Samuel glanced at Mary, who had gone very still at the stove, clearly listening for his response. "Would you like that?" Samuel asked carefully. "Oh, yes." Daniel's face lit up with enthusiasm. "I like it here. I like taking care of the horses and learning about the mountains and—" He paused, then added more quietly, "I like having a family again." Mary turned from the stove, her eyes bright with tears she was trying not to shed. "Daniel, sweetheart, it's not that simple. We can't just—" "Why not?" Daniel interrupted with the logic of childhood. "Uncle Samuel likes having us here, don't you, Uncle Samuel? And we help with everything, and we're not any trouble, and—" "You're no trouble at all," Samuel interrupted gently. "But your aunt's right that it's complicated. There are things you don't understand yet about grown-up problems." Daniel's face fell, but he nodded with the reluctant acceptance children learned when adult concerns intruded on their hopes. Later that night, after Daniel had gone to sleep, Samuel found Mary sitting by the fire, working on some delicate embroidery that would eventually become clothing for the baby. The sight of her preparing for new life with such care and hope, despite all the uncertainty they faced, stirred something profound in Samuel's chest. "About what Daniel said earlier," he began carefully. Mary looked up from her needlework, her expression guarded. "Children don't understand how the world works. They think wanting something badly enough can make it happen. Maybe sometimes it can," Samuel said quietly. "Mary, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." She set down her sewing, giving him her complete attention. "Do you want to stay here? Not just until spring, not just until the baby comes, but permanently." "As my wife," the words came out more bluntly than he'd intended, lacking the careful preparation and romantic setting he'd been planning. But once spoken, they hung between them with unmistakable clarity. Mary's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, hope, fear, and something that might have been longing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Samuel, you don't understand what you're asking. What you'd be taking on. There are things about my past, about Daniel's situation." "Then tell me," Samuel interrupted gently. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Mary was quiet for so long that Samuel began to fear he'd pushed too hard, moved too fast. But when she finally looked at him, Her eyes held the vulnerability of someone preparing to risk everything on. Trust, Daniel's father, his real father, is a man named Jeremiah Walsh. He's also my husband, legally. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for weeks. He's Daniel's biological father, but he never wanted children. When Ellen died, I took Daniel and ran. Jeremiah has legal rights to him and to me. What I've done, keeping Daniel from his legal father, crossing state lines, it's kidnapping according to the law. Samuel absorbed this information with the calm attention he'd learned to bring to crisis situations. The legal complexities were serious, but they weren't insurmountable. More importantly, they explained the fear he'd sensed in Mary, the way she startled at unexpected sounds, the careful way she guarded information about their origins. Where is he now? Samuel asked practically. I don't know. Looking for us, probably. He has money, influence. If he finds us... Mary's hand moved protectively to her belly. He won't, Samuel said with quiet certainty. And even if he does, you won't face him alone. Mary's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for weeks. Samuel, you don't understand. Marrying me wouldn't just be taking on a ready-made family. It would be defying legal authority, harboring a fugitive. You could lose everything. Samuel reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand in his. Mary, I lost everything once already when Sarah died. These past weeks with you and Daniel, that's not losing everything. That's finding everything I thought was gone forever. The simple truth of his words seemed to break something loose in Mary's careful control. She leaned forward, covering her face with her free hand as tears finally came. I'm so tired of running, she whispered. So tired of being afraid. Then stop running, Samuel said softly. Marry me. Let me help you fight whatever comes. Let us build something here that's worth protecting. Outside, the mountain wind sang through the pines with its eternal song of solitude and endurance. But inside the cabin, two people who had learned to survive loss and hardship began to plan for a future that looked less like survival and more like the life they'd both thought they'd lost. Forever. The first sign of trouble came with the early morning mist that often preceded the arrival of strangers in the mountains. Samuel was checking his trap lines when he spotted the riders, 3 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful determination of people who knew exactly where they were going. Even at a distance, something about their formation and bearing suggested official business rather than casual travel. Samuel's military instincts, honed by years of combat and refined by 15 years of mountain survival, immediately shifted into high alert. He melted back into the tree line, using skills that had kept him alive through countless dangerous situations, and began a careful approach that would let him observe without being seen. The lead rider was a tall man in his 40s, wearing a heavy coat that couldn't quite conceal the quality of his clothing underneath. His bearing suggested someone accustomed to authority and confident in his ability to enforce his will. Behind him rode 2 men who had the unmistakable look of hired muscle, hard-faced, well-armed, alert to their surroundings, in the way of men who expected trouble and were prepared to handle it. But it was the 4th member of their party that made Samuel's blood run cold. Bringing up the rear, apparently under some form of constraint, was a young woman who looked so much like Mary that she could have been her sister. The resemblance was uncanny. The same brown hair, the same delicate features, the same intelligent eyes that now held a mixture of fear and defiance. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Had Jeremiah Walsh found them somehow? Was this woman a relative being used as leverage? Or was the situation even more complicated than Mary had revealed? As the riders approached his cabin, Samuel could hear voices carrying across the thin mountain air. The lead rider, Walsh, Samuel was now certain, was speaking to someone with the calm authority of a man explaining a situation he controlled completely. Simple matter of recovering my property, Walsh was saying. My wife and the boy she took from me. I have legal documentation proving my rights, and I've brought law enforcement to ensure there's no misunderstanding about jurisdiction. Samuel's heart sank as he processed this information. Legal documentation. Law enforcement. These weren't just hired thugs. They were operating with official sanction, which made the situation infinitely more complex and dangerous. Moving carefully through the trees, Samuel worked his way closer to the cabin, desperate to warn Mary and Daniel, but knowing he needed more information before acting. As he reached a position where he could see the cabin clearly, his worst fears were confirmed. Mary had emerged from the cabin, drawn by the sound of approaching horses. Even from a distance, Samuel could see the way she froze when she recognized the lead rider, her hand moving instinctively to protect her unborn child. Daniel appeared behind her, and Samuel watched the boy's confusion transform into recognition and fear, as he too identified their unexpected visitors. "Hello, Mary," Walsh called out with false warmth. "You've led us quite a chase, but as you can see, it's time to come home." "This is my home," Mary replied, her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising steadiness, despite the tremor Samuel could detect underneath. Walsh's laugh was cold and dismissive. "This hovel. My dear wife, you've clearly taken leave of your senses. But no matter, we're here to collect you and Daniel and return you both to your proper place." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Mary said, stepping forward so that she stood between Walsh and Daniel. "And neither is Daniel." It was then that Walsh revealed his trump card. With a gesture, he brought forward the young woman Samuel had noticed earlier, and the family resemblance became even more apparent up close. "I think you'll reconsider when you meet someone," Walsh said with obvious satisfaction. "This is Catherine Walsh, my daughter from my first marriage. She's here to help explain your legal situation." Mary's face went white as she stared at the young woman. "Catherine? But you were supposed to be at school in Boston. How did he—" "Father withdrew me from school 3 months ago," Catherine said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "He's been using me as bait to draw you out, Mary. He's had men watching your old friends, your former employers, anyone who might have helped you. When that didn't work, he decided to make the stakes clearer. The pieces of Walsh's strategy were falling into place with terrifying clarity. He hadn't just been searching for Mary and Daniel. He'd been systematically eliminating their support network and gathering leverage to ensure their compliance when he finally tracked them down. "You see, Mary," Walsh continued with obvious satisfaction, "Catherine's future depends entirely on your cooperation. If you come home quietly, she returns to her education and her comfortable life. If you continue this foolish resistance, well, a young woman can face many dangers in the world without family protection." Samuel felt rage building in his chest like a physical force. Walsh wasn't just threatening Mary and Daniel. He was using his own daughter as a weapon, manipulating family bonds to achieve his goals. The casual cruelty of the strategy revealed a man who viewed other people as possessions to be managed rather than individuals with rights and feelings. But worse revelations were still to come. One of Walsh's companions, a man wearing a badge that identified him as some form of law enforcement, stepped forward with a document that he began reading in the formal tones of legal. "Proclamation, by order of the Territorial Court, Mary Walsh is commanded to return with her lawful husband to face charges of kidnapping, theft of property, and abandonment of marital duties. The minor child, Daniel Walsh, is to be returned to the custody of his legal father. Resistance to this order constitutes obstruction of justice and will be met with appropriate force." Samuel's military mind automatically began assessing tactical options. 3 armed men, plus the complication of Catherine as an essentially innocent hostage. Mary was visibly pregnant and couldn't be expected to move quickly. Daniel was just a boy. The odds were overwhelmingly against any form of physical resistance, but as he watched Walsh's men spread out in a formation designed to prevent escape, Samuel realized that simple physical considerations weren't the only factors at play. The legal document the officer had read meant that Walsh had managed to manipulate the territorial court system, possibly through corruption, or simply by presenting a one-sided version of events. "I have something else that might interest you." "Mary," Walsh said, producing a folded paper from his coat with theatrical flourish. a wanted poster. It seems you're quite valuable. $500 for information leading to your capture. That's enough money to ensure that everyone between here and Denver will be watching for a pregnant woman traveling with a young boy. Mary's composure finally cracked as she realized the full scope of Walsh's preparation. He hadn't just found them. He'd systematically eliminated their options for future escape. Every town, every way station, every possible refuge between their current location and safety would now be hostile territory. "There's nowhere left to run, my dear wife," Walsh said with satisfaction. "Your only choice is to come home and accept the consequences of your actions." It was then that Daniel stepped forward, his young voice clear and defiant in the mountain air. "She's not your wife anymore, and you're not my father. My father was kind and gentle, and he never hurt anyone." Walsh's face darkened with genuine anger for the first time. "You insolent little—" He started forward, but Mary quickly moved to shield Daniel with her body. "Don't you dare touch him," Mary said, her voice carrying a steel that surprised everyone present. "I'll touch my own son whenever I please," Walsh snapped. "And if you've been filling his head with lies about his parentage—" "Lies." Mary's voice rose with indignation. "You want to talk about lies? Tell him about the bruises, Jeremiah. Tell him about the nights when Ellen was too afraid to sleep because she never knew what would set you off. Tell him about the accident that killed his mother." The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow. Catherine gasped audibly, and even Walsh's hired men exchanged uncomfortable glances. Walsh himself went very still, his face cycling through emotions before settling on cold fury. "You'll regret saying that," he said quietly. "You'll regret it for a very long time." Hidden in the tree line, Samuel touched the ring hanging beneath his shirt and made a decision that would change all their lives forever. He might not be able to fight the law, but he had information that Walsh didn't know he possessed. Samuel had spent 15 years learning every trail, every cave, every possible escape route through these mountains. More importantly, he had something Walsh had completely failed to account for in his carefully laid plans. Samuel had allies. As he began to move through the forest toward his hidden cache of weapons and supplies, Samuel started forming a plan that would either save the family he'd come to love or get them all killed in the attempt. But one thing was certain: he would not let Jeremiah Walsh take Mary and Daniel without a fight that the man would remember for the rest of his life. The stakes had just been raised beyond anything Samuel had imagined possible. It was no longer just about love or family or the future they'd been planning together. It was about justice versus law, about protecting the innocent against those who would use legal authority to perpetrate moral crimes. Samuel Creek had spent 15 years hiding from the world, but the world had finally found him. Now it was time to discover whether the man who had once been known as one of the most effective cavalry officers in the Union Army still possessed the skills and courage necessary to protect everything that mattered to him, moving through the forest with the silent precision that had once made him legendary among his fellow cavalry officers. Samuel reached his hidden supply cache within 20 minutes of leaving the confrontation at his cabin, buried beneath a carefully camouflaged stone outcropping. Wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed against the mountain weather were the weapons and equipment he'd hoped never to need again. His service revolver, cleaned and maintained despite years of disuse. Extra ammunition, a cavalry saber that had served him through countless engagements during the war. Most importantly, a small wooden box that contained his military commendations and service records, proof of skills and reputation that might serve as currency in the desperate gamble he was about to undertake. Among the commendations was one in particular that Samuel studied by the week, winter sunlight filtering through the pine canopy. A citation for extraordinary valor during the Battle of Cedar Creek, signed by General Philip Sheridan himself, describing Lieutenant Samuel Creek's tactical brilliance in turning certain defeat into decisive victory through unconventional battlefield strategy and inspired leadership. The man described in that commendation seemed like a stranger to Samuel now, someone from a different life who had possessed confidence and authority that 15 years of isolation had worn away. But as he read the formal language describing his wartime exploits, Samuel felt something stirring that he'd thought was permanently buried: the cold, calculating mindset of a professional soldier faced with impossible odds and determined to prevail regardless of cost. Walsh had made several critical errors in his approach, mistakes that revealed a man accustomed to using legal and financial power to achieve his goals rather than actual strategy. He'd brought too few men for the terrain, failed to scout adequately for potential threats, and most crucially, he'd underestimated both the resources available to his opponents and their willingness to use them. Samuel's first priority was intelligence gathering, using skills that had kept him alive through years of reconnaissance missions. He began a careful survey of Walsh's position and resources. The three men had made camp in the clearing near his cabin, clearly intending to stay until Mary and Daniel agreed to accompany them. Their horses were hobbled nearby, their supplies adequate for several days, but not indefinitely. Most tellingly, they'd positioned themselves with confidence that suggested they expected no serious resistance from a pregnant woman, a child, and whatever mountain hermit might be providing them. Shelter. They hadn't accounted for the possibility that the mountain hermit might be a decorated war veteran, with 15 years of accumulated knowledge about every defensive advantage the terrain offered. As he observed their camp through field glasses salvaged from his military kit, Samuel noted details that would prove crucial in the coming confrontation. Walsh himself was clearly unused to outdoor living and was already showing signs of discomfort with the cold and primitive conditions. The law enforcement officer, Samuel had identified him as a territorial marshal based on his badge and bearing, was competent but not exceptional. The sort of man who relied on legal authority rather than tactical skill. The third man, the hired muscle, was the most dangerous of the group, alert, experienced, and comfortable with the prospect of violence, but Samuel's greatest advantage lay not in his assessment of Walsh's weaknesses, but in his knowledge of potential allies. The Henderson family, 20 miles away, included not just Jim and Ruth, but their 3 adult sons, all of whom had served in various military capacities, and all of whom held strong opinions about men who mistreated women and children. The trading post at Rabbit Creek was run by Marcus Stone, a former cavalry sergeant who owed Samuel his life from an engagement at Brandy Station and had never forgotten the debt. Most importantly, the scattered mountain community included several families who had come west specifically to escape legal troubles in the States, people who understood that law and justice weren't always the same thing, and who would be naturally sympathetic to someone in Mary's position. Samuel's plan began to take shape as he moved through the forest, visiting caches of supplies and weapons he'd established over the years, preparing for contingencies he'd hoped would never arise. It was a plan that would require precise timing, careful coordination, and a willingness to risk everything on the hope that 15 years of peaceful isolation hadn't completely eroded his capacity for complex military operations. The first phase involved getting word to his potential allies without alerting Walsh to the broader scope of resistance he was about to face. Samuel had established a network of signal fires years ago, a communication system that could carry simple messages across vast distances in a matter of hours. By nightfall, smoke would be rising from carefully positioned locations throughout the territory, carrying the coded message that would bring help from quarters Walsh couldn't imagine. But before any larger strategy could be implemented, Samuel knew he had to ensure Mary and Daniel's immediate safety. Walsh's patience wouldn't last indefinitely, and Samuel had already detected signs that the man's civilized veneer was beginning to crack under the stress of mountain conditions and unexpected resistance. As darkness approached, Samuel made his way back to a position where he could observe the cabin. What he saw made his blood run cold. Walsh had apparently grown tired of waiting for Mary's cooperation and had escalated his tactics. Mary and Daniel were now clearly prisoners, forced to remain inside the cabin under guard, while Walsh's men took turns maintaining watch outside. Through the window, Samuel could see Catherine sitting beside Mary, both women's faces reflecting the strain of their situation. Daniel was nowhere to be seen, which worried Samuel until he spotted the boy through another window, apparently confined to the bedroom, but unharmed. The sight of his chosen family under armed guard triggered something primal in Samuel's chest. For 15 years, he'd lived with the guilt of being unable to protect Sarah and their child from the fever that took them. He'd sworn then never to care so deeply about anyone again, never to risk the devastating helplessness that came with loving someone beyond his power to save. But watching Walsh's casual violation of everything Samuel held sacred, the sanctity of home, the protection of women and children, the basic human decency that made civilization possible, Samuel realized that some principles were worth any risk. Mary and Daniel weren't just people he'd grown to love. They represented his chance at redemption, his opportunity to prove that when it mattered most, he could be the protector he'd failed to be for Sarah. As he settled into position for a long night of surveillance and planning, Samuel began to catalogue every detail of Walsh's operation. Guard rotations, weapon placements, the location of horses and supplies, the psychological dynamics between the three men that might be exploited to create confusion and opportunity. The territorial marshal, Samuel had learned his name was Deputy. Bradley, from overheard conversations, was clearly uncomfortable with the increasingly coercive nature of their mission. He'd signed on to serve legal papers and escort a runaway wife home, not to hold a pregnant woman and child at gunpoint in a remote mountain cabin. Samuel could see the man's growing unease in his body language, the way he avoided looking directly at Mary, the reluctance with which he participated in Walsh's more heavy-handed tactics. The hired gun, introduced as Cain, showed no such moral flexibility. He watched Mary and Daniel with the cold assessment of a predator evaluating prey, and Samuel had already noted the casual way he kept his hand near his weapon. Cain was the immediate threat, the man most likely to resort to violence if the situation deteriorated further. Walsh himself represented the greatest long-term danger. As the hours passed and the comfortable resolution he'd expected failed to materialize, his facade of legal propriety was giving way to something uglier. Samuel had seen that transformation before, in officers who'd let power corrupt their judgment, in men who'd convinced themselves that their authority justified any action. Near midnight, Samuel's careful observation was rewarded with crucial intelligence. Cain had grown careless during his watch, allowing Samuel to get close enough to overhear a conversation that revealed the true scope of Walsh's desperation. "Can't stay here much longer," Cain was saying quietly. "This altitude, these conditions, it's harder than you led me to believe." "We stay until she agrees to come home," Walsh replied firmly. "I've invested too much in finding her to leave empty-handed now, and if she doesn't agree, if this mountain man shows up with local support—" "You said yourself there are families up here who don't much care for outside authority." Walsh's laugh was cold and bitter. "Then we stop asking politely. Mary is my legal wife and Daniel is my legal son. I have every right to use whatever force is necessary to recover my property." The casual way Walsh referred to Mary and Daniel as property confirmed Samuel's worst fears about the man's character. This wasn't about family or even wounded pride. It was about control, about a man who couldn't tolerate the idea that his possessions might have agency of their own. "What about the girl?" Cain asked, nodding toward the cabin where Catherine sat with Mary. "Catherine understands her duty to family," Walsh said dismissively. "She'll do as she's told, or she'll learn the consequences of disobedience." Samuel felt sick as he realized the full scope of Walsh's manipulation. Catherine wasn't just a hostage or a tool of coercion, she was another victim, trapped by the same system of legal and financial control that had driven Mary to desperate flight. As the night wore on, Samuel continued his preparations for the confrontation he knew was coming. He cached weapons and supplies at strategic locations around the cabin, prepared escape routes that could be used if retreat became necessary, and most importantly, set the signal fires that would bring help from the broader mountain community. The smoke rising from carefully positioned peaks would carry a message that every resident of the high country would understand. Trouble. Help needed. Bring weapons. It was a call that had been answered before, when outside threats had endangered their way of life. And Samuel prayed it would be answered again, when people who mattered to him faced destruction at the hands of those who mistook legal authority for moral righteousness. By dawn, Samuel knew he would either be dead or he would have saved the family that had brought meaning back to his life. The thought should have terrified him, but instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, the calm certainty of a professional soldier who had identified his mission and committed completely to its success. As he settled into position for the final hours before dawn, Samuel touched the ring beneath his shirt one last time. Sarah would have understood what he was about to do and why it was necessary. She would have recognized that sometimes love required more than gentle words and warm embraces. Sometimes it demanded the willingness to face overwhelming odds in defense of what mattered most. The mountain wind carried the scent of snow and pine, the eternal perfume of the high country that had been Samuel's companion through 15 years of solitude. But tonight, that wind also carried something else, the distant scent of smoke from signal fires, and with it, the promise that when morning came, Samuel Creek would not face his enemies alone. Dawn broke gray and cold over the mountain peaks, bringing with it the sound of approaching horses from 3 different directions. Samuel's signal fires had done their work. Help was coming from the scattered homesteads and settlements that made up their isolated community. But as he watched Walsh's men react to the sound of multiple riders converging on their position, Samuel knew that the next few hours would determine whether his desperate gamble would save Mary and Daniel or get them all killed. The first to arrive was Jim Henderson, riding hard despite his 60-plus years, his ancient Henry rifle across his saddle and his face set in the grim expression Samuel remembered from their occasional discussions about territorial politics and the rights of mountain folk to live free from outside interference. Behind Jim came his 3 sons, Tom, Jake, and Billy, all armed and all wearing the determined look of men who had ridden through dangerous country to answer a call for help. From the eastern approach came Marcus Stone from the trading post, accompanied by 2 men Samuel didn't immediately recognize, but who carried themselves with the bearing of former soldiers. The signal fire network had reached farther than Samuel had dared hope, drawing support from quarters he hadn't expected. Walsh emerged from the cabin as the sound of approaching riders became unmistakable, his face cycling through confusion, alarm, and finally cold calculation as he assessed this unexpected development. Kane stepped out behind him, hand already resting on his weapon, while Deputy Bradley remained inside, whether from tactical positioning or reluctance to participate in what was clearly escalating beyond his comfort level. "Mr. Creek," Jim Henderson called out as his group reached the edge of the clearing. "Saw your smoke last night. Thought you could use some neighborly assistance." Samuel stepped out of the tree line, his cavalry saber at his side and his service revolver holstered but visible. The weapon hanging from his belt was more than just a tool. It was a symbol of authority and experience that every man present would recognize and respect. "Appreciate you coming, Jim," Samuel replied, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had commanded troops in desperate situations. "Seems we have some visitors who don't understand mountain hospitality." Walsh's eyes widened as he took in Samuel's appearance and bearing. This wasn't the simple hermit he'd expected to find harboring his wife and son. This was clearly a man with military experience and the kind of reputation that could draw armed support from across the territory. "I am Jeremiah Walsh," Walsh announced, attempting to regain control of the situation through formal authority. I'm here on legal business, recovering my wife and son, who were taken from me illegally. I have documentation. Don't much care about your documentation, Jim Henderson interrupted flatly. Care about what's right and what's wrong. And holding a pregnant woman and a child at gunpoint strikes me as pretty clearly wrong. Marcus Stone had moved his horse to a position that gave him a clear view of Kane, recognizing the hired gun as the most immediate threat. Samuel, he called out, everything all right with Miss Mary and the boy? Samuel's eyes never left Walsh's face as he replied, They're alive. Beyond that, we'll have to see how reasonable Mr. Walsh wants to be about resolving this situation. It was then that the cabin door opened and Mary emerged, moving with careful dignity despite her obvious pregnancy and the strain of the night's ordeal. Behind her came Catherine, supporting Daniel, who looked shaken but unharmed. The sight of Mary free and moving under her own power told Samuel that whatever control Walsh had maintained through the night was beginning to slip. Samuel, Mary called out, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. Thank God you're safe. I was so afraid they'd... I'm fine, Samuel replied, though he kept his attention focused on Walsh and Kane. Are you hurt? Either of you? We're all right, Mary assured him, though Samuel could see the exhaustion and fear in her face. But Samuel, there's something you need to know. About Catherine. About why she's really here. Walsh's face darkened with anger as he realized Mary was about to reveal information he'd preferred to keep private. Mary, I warn you, no more warnings, Catherine interrupted, stepping forward with sudden resolve. No more lies and manipulation. She looked directly at Samuel, her young face set with determination that reminded him powerfully of Mary's courage. My name is Catherine Walsh, and this man is my father. But everything else he's told you is a lie. The revelation that followed transformed the entire nature of the confrontation. Speaking quickly but clearly, Catherine revealed that Walsh had withdrawn her from school, not to use her as leverage against Mary, but because he could no longer afford the tuition. His business ventures had failed, his property had been seized by creditors, and his pursuit of Mary and Daniel was driven not by paternal concern, but by the desperate need to access a trust fund that Ellen, Daniel's mother, had established before her death. Daniel's inheritance, Catherine explained, her voice shaking with emotion. It's substantial, and it passes to his guardian when he reaches majority. Father needs that money to avoid bankruptcy and imprisonment for fraud. That's why he's so determined to maintain legal custody, not for love, but for financial survival. The implications of this revelation rippled through the assembled men like shockwaves. What they had assumed was a domestic dispute between husband and wife was actually a criminal conspiracy involving theft of a child's inheritance and the manipulation of legal authority for fraudulent purposes. Deputy Bradley emerged from the cabin at that moment, his face reflecting the moral conflict that had been building through the night. Mr. Walsh, he said carefully, if what this young lady is saying is true, then my authority here is based on false information. I was told this was a simple matter of returning a runaway wife and recovering a kidnapped child. She's lying, Walsh snapped. But his voice carried the desperation of a man whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Catherine is confused, upset by this whole situation. Mary has obviously been filling her head with, Father, stop. Catherine's voice cut through Walsh's protestations with quiet authority. I've brought proof. She reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a bundle of papers that she handed to Deputy Bradley. Financial records, correspondence with lawyers, documentation of the trust fund, and Father's attempts to gain access to it through various legal maneuvers. As Bradley examined the papers, his expression grew increasingly grim. Samuel watched the man's face carefully, recognizing the moment when legal authority shifted from supporting Walsh to opposing him. Mr. Walsh, Bradley said finally, his voice formal and cold. These documents suggest that your petition for custody was based on fraudulent claims about the child's financial status and your wife's mental competency. Furthermore, they indicate that you may have committed perjury in your sworn statements to the territorial court. Kane had been growing increasingly agitated as the situation deteriorated around his employer. Samuel caught the subtle shift in the man's posture that indicated he was preparing to resort to violence rather than allow Walsh to be taken into custody. "Kane," Samuel said quietly, his hand moving to rest on his saber's hilt, "I'd think real careful about your next move. You're outnumbered 6-1 by men who know this country better than you know your own backyard." Kane's eyes flicked between Samuel and the other armed men surrounding the clearing, calculating odds that were clearly not in his favor. But before he could make a decision, the situation took another unexpected turn. Mary stepped forward, moving with the careful deliberation of a woman who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to face its consequences. "Deputy Bradley," she said formally, "I want to press charges against Jeremiah Walsh for fraud, intimidation, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to defraud a minor of his lawful inheritance." The words hung in the mountain air like a challenge thrown down before God and witnesses. What had begun as Walsh's attempt to reclaim his property had transformed into his complete legal and moral defeat, witnessed by a community that would ensure the truth of these events spread throughout the territory. Samuel felt a fierce pride as he watched Mary take control of her destiny, refusing to remain a victim of Walsh's manipulations. This was the woman he'd fallen in love with, not just for her gentleness and domestic skills, but for the core of steel that had enabled her to protect Daniel and seek justice despite overwhelming odds. But even as legal authority shifted decisively against Walsh, Samuel knew the immediate physical danger was far from over. Desperate men with weapons made unpredictable choices, and Kane in particular looked like someone with nothing left to lose. The moment of reckoning came as Deputy Bradley reached for the handcuffs on his belt, his intention to arrest Walsh clear to everyone present. Kane's hand dropped to his gun with the speed of professional violence, but Samuel had been watching for exactly that movement. 15 years of mountain living hadn't dulled the reflexes that had kept him alive through dozens of cavalry engagements. Samuel's saber cleared its sheath in a fluid motion that seemed to slow time itself, the polished steel catching the morning light as it arced toward Kane's gun hand. The blade, inscribed with Samuel's name and unit designation from his days as a Union cavalry officer, had been forged for exactly this purpose, protecting the innocent against those who would use violence to impose their will. Kane's shot went wide as Samuel's blade struck his wrist, the bullet embedding harmlessly in a pine tree 20 feet away. The hired gun stumbled backward, clutching his wounded arm and staring at Samuel with a mixture of shock and newfound respect. "Next man who draws a weapon gets more than a scratch," Samuel announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded men in battle and meant every word he spoke. Walsh, seeing his last hope of violent resolution disappear, made a desperate lunge toward Mary, perhaps thinking to use her as a shield or bargaining chip. But he had forgotten about the other members of the mountain community who had answered Samuel's call for help. Jim Henderson's rifle barrel blocked Walsh's path with gentle but unmistakable firmness. "I wouldn't," Jim said mildly. "Mountain folk don't take kindly to men who threaten pregnant women." It was then that Mary stepped forward with something in her hand that transformed the entire confrontation. From her Bible, she withdrew a folded document that she handed to Deputy Bradley with steady fingers. "This is my sister Ellen's final letter," Mary said clearly, written 3 days before she died, witnessed by the doctor and the minister who attended her final illness. In it, she specifically names me as Daniel's guardian and legal parent, and she details Jeremiah's violence toward her and his threats against Daniel's safety. Bradley unfolded the letter with careful hands, reading quickly through contents that made his face grow increasingly grave. When he looked up, his expression held the cold fury of a lawman who had been deliberately misled and used as a tool for criminal purposes. "Mr. Walsh," Bradley said formally, "this document constitutes legal proof that your custody claims are fraudulent." Furthermore, it provides evidence of domestic violence and child endangerment that makes your presence near this family a violation of territorial law. Walsh's face cycled through emotions: rage, desperation, and finally the cunning of a man searching for any possible escape from complete defeat. "You can't trust anything, Mary says," he protested. "She's clearly unstable, running off into the wilderness with a child, living in sin with some mountain hermit. Living in sin." Samuel's voice cut through Walsh's desperate accusations with quiet authority. "Deputy Bradley, I'd like you to witness something." Samuel reached into his shirt and withdrew the simple iron wedding band he'd been crafting in secret, holding it up so that all present could see the careful workmanship and obvious intent behind its creation. "Mary Walsh," Samuel said formally, dropping to one knee in the snow before the woman he loved, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you let me protect you and Daniel and the child you carry? Will you help me build a family that's based on love instead of fear?" The proposal, delivered in the midst of armed confrontation and legal crisis, struck everyone present with its simple sincerity and perfect timing. Mary's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at Samuel's weathered face, seeing in his expression not just love, but the unwavering commitment of a man who had found his purpose in protecting what mattered most. "Yes," Mary said simply, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Yes, Samuel Creek, I will marry you." Samuel slipped the handmade ring onto Mary's finger. The simple ceremony, witnessed by armed neighbors, and sealed by the kind of commitment that transcended legal documents and social conventions. In that moment, Walsh's claims to authority over Mary became not just legally void, but morally irrelevant. Catherine stepped forward then, her young face shining with something approaching joy for the first time since her arrival. "Deputy Bradley," she said clearly, "I formally request legal emancipation from my father's custody and protection under territorial law as a witness to his criminal activities." The systematic destruction of Walsh's position was now complete. His wife had remarried, his legal claims had been proven fraudulent, his financial crimes had been exposed, and even his own daughter had turned against him. Kane, still clutching his wounded wrist, was looking around desperately for escape routes that didn't exist. "Jeremiah Walsh," Deputy Bradley announced formally, "you are under arrest for fraud, perjury, conspiracy to defraud a minor, and violation of territorial custody laws. Kane Morrison, you are under arrest as an accessory to these crimes and for assault with a deadly weapon." As Bradley moved to secure his prisoners, Jim Henderson approached Samuel with a grin that spoke of deep satisfaction at seeing justice properly served. "Fine work, Samuel," Jim said quietly. "It'd been a long time since I've seen a man handle trouble with that kind of skill and judgment." Samuel looked around the clearing at the faces of his neighbors, men who had ridden through dangerous country to answer his call for help, who had stood with him against outside threats to their community, who would carry the story of this day throughout the territory as proof that mountain folk protected their own. "Couldn't have done it without all of you," Samuel replied honestly. "This was never just about one family. It was about whether decent people would stand together against those who'd use law and authority to do wrong." Mary approached them, Daniel's hand firmly in hers, her face reflecting the profound relief of someone who had finally escaped from years of fear and uncertainty. "Samuel," she said softly, "how can we ever thank all of you?" "No thanks needed," Marcus Stone called out from his position watching the prisoners. "This is what neighbors do for each other. Besides," he added with a grin, "it's been the most excitement we've had up here in years." As Deputy Bradley prepared to transport Walsh and Kane down the mountain for trial, Catherine approached Samuel and Mary with obvious nervousness. "I know I don't have any right to ask," she began hesitantly, "but I was wondering, that is, if it wouldn't be too much trouble. Could I stay here for a while? I have nowhere else to go, and I'd like to help with the baby when it comes." Mary's response was immediate and warm. "Of course you can stay. You're family now, Catherine. Family takes care of family. The simple acceptance of Walsh's daughter into their growing household represented the final transformation of the morning's events. What had begun as a confrontation between enemies had ended with the creation of a family bound together not by law or blood alone, but by choice and mutual protection. As the sun climbed higher over the mountain peaks and the sounds of departure filled the clearing, horses being saddled, weapons being secured, prisoners being prepared for transport, Samuel found himself standing with his arm around his new wife, watching Daniel and Catherine help their neighbors prepare for the journey to town. The boy who had arrived at his cabin as a frightened refugee was now chattering excitedly with Tom Henderson about horses and hunting, his face bright with the confidence of a child who knew he was safe and loved. Catherine, freed from years of her father's manipulation, was helping Mary organize supplies for the men's journey with the efficient grace of someone discovering her own strength. Samuel touched the spot where Sarah's ring had hung for 15 years, now empty but somehow lighter rather than hollow. His first wife would have understood and approved of what had happened here today. She would have recognized that love wasn't diminished by being shared, that family wasn't weakened by growing larger, and that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in solitary endurance, but in opening one's heart to new possibilities. As Walsh and Kane were led away under guard, their faces reflecting the defeat of men who had mistaken power for strength and authority for righteousness, Samuel realized that his long exile from human connection was finally over. The mountain hermit, who had placed a simple advertisement for a cook, had discovered something far more valuable than domestic help. He had found the family he'd thought was lost forever, and the purpose that came from protecting what mattered most. Spring came early to the mountains that year, arriving with the sudden warmth and abundant snowmelt that transformed the harsh winter landscape into something bright with possibility. The cabin that had housed one solitary man through 15 seasons of isolation now rang with the sounds of family life. Mary's gentle humming as she worked in the expanded kitchen, Daniel's excited chatter as he helped Samuel with the morning chores, Catherine's quiet laughter as she read aloud from the growing collection of books that had become central to their evening. Entertainment. 3 months had passed since Walsh's arrest and conviction, on charges that had ultimately included not just fraud and perjury, but embezzlement from his own business partners. The territorial court had not only validated Mary's custody of Daniel, but had awarded her substantial damages from the recovery of the boy's inheritance. More importantly, Catherine had been granted legal emancipation and had chosen to remain with the family that had welcomed her with such open hearts. The baby, Sarah Grace Creek, named for Samuel's first wife, with Mary's loving insistence, had arrived on a night when the March wind howled through the pines and the nearest doctor was still days away through impassable mountain passes. But Ruth Henderson had been there, bringing her considerable experience and calm authority to the birth that had given Samuel his second chance at fatherhood. Holding his daughter for the first time, feeling her tiny fingers wrap around his calloused thumb with the instinctive trust of new life, Samuel had experienced something he'd thought was lost forever. The fierce protectiveness and overwhelming love that came with being responsible for someone completely innocent and dependent. "She's beautiful," Mary had whispered from the bed where she rested after the long labor, her face exhausted but radiant with maternal joy. "She has your eyes, Samuel. She has your strength," Samuel had replied, thinking of the courage Mary had shown throughout the pregnancy and birth, the way she'd faced every challenge with quiet determination and unshakable faith in their family's future. Now, as summer approached and the high meadows began to show the first green shoots of new grass, the family had settled into routines that felt as natural as breathing. Daniel, officially adopted and bearing the Creek name with obvious pride, had grown 3 inches and gained the confidence that came from having a father who taught him skills and wisdom with patient dedication. Catherine had blossomed from the frightened, manipulated girl who'd arrived with Walsh into a young woman discovering her own strength and intelligence. The family Bible, its worn leather cover now holding even more pressed flowers and precious memories. Sat open on the kitchen table where Mary had been recording the milestones of their new life together. Samuel's and Mary's wedding, performed by the traveling minister who made quarterly visits to the mountain communities. Daniel's adoption. Sarah Grace's birth. Catherine's 18th birthday, celebrated with a cake that had required a special trip to the trading post for proper ingredients between the pages that chronicled their growing family were the flowers that marked their journey, wildflowers from their wedding day, pressed with the same care Ellen had once used to preserve her own precious memories. A sprig of pine from the tree under which Samuel had first proposed, added by Daniel, who had appointed himself the family's official record keeper. Apple blossoms from the small orchard Samuel and Catherine had planted together, looking toward futures they would build with their own hands. "Papa Samuel," Sarah Grace gurgled from her father's arms as he sat in the rocking chair he'd crafted during the long winter evenings. "The baby's trying to tell you something important. Daniel, now 10, and possessed of the wisdom that came from surviving hardship and finding safety, had appointed himself the baby's official interpreter. His relationship with Samuel had evolved from the desperate gratitude of a refugee child to the easy affection of a son who knew himself loved and valued. Is that right?" Samuel asked seriously, treating Daniel's observation with the respect he'd learned to show for the boy's insights. "What do you think she's trying to say?" "She's saying thank you," Daniel replied with the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood. "Thank you for making us a real family." The simple words struck Samuel with their profound truth. This was what he'd found in the year since placing that simple advertisement. Not just a cook or housekeeper, but the family he'd thought was lost forever. Mary, whose quiet strength and gentle wisdom had taught him that love was something that grew stronger when shared, rather than weakened by loss. Daniel, whose curiosity and resilience had reminded him of the joy that came from teaching and guiding young minds. Catherine, whose courage in breaking free from her father's manipulation had shown him that family was about choice and commitment rather than simple blood relation. And now Sarah Grace, who represented the future they were building together. "Do you ever regret it?" Mary asked quietly as she joined him on the cabin's front porch, settling into the second rocking chair he'd built to accommodate their growing family. "Giving up your solitude for all this noise and complication?" Samuel looked around at the scene before them, Daniel teaching Catherine to whittle in the shade of the pine trees, baby Sarah Grace sleeping peacefully in his arms, the vegetable garden they'd all worked together to plant, showing the first green shoots of the summer's harvest. The cabin itself had been expanded twice, now boasting a proper kitchen, a room for Catherine and a nursery for the baby, with plans already drawn for additional space as their family continued to grow. "Not for a moment," Samuel replied honestly. "I thought I was living when I was alone up here, but I was just surviving. This," he gestured to encompass all of it, the family and the home and the future they were building together. "This is what living actually looks like." Mary's smile was soft with contentment and love. Ellen would have been so happy to see Daniel like this, confident and safe and loved. She always said that children needed roots and wings both, and I think he's finally got both here. "What about you?" Samuel asked gently. "Do you have what you need here?" Mary reached over to take his free hand, her fingers intertwining with his in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the months of their marriage. "I have everything I ever dreamed of, and more than I ever dared hope for. I have a husband who treats me as an equal partner, children who are safe and thriving, and a home where love is the foundation of everything we build." As evening approached, and the mountain air filled with the scents of pine and wildflowers, the family gathered for their traditional sunset meal on the porch. Catherine had prepared bread that rivaled anything available in town. Daniel had picked fresh berries from the bushes Samuel had shown him in the high meadows, and Mary had created a feast from ingredients that would have seemed impossible to transform into something so satisfying. "Before we eat," Samuel said, standing with Sarah Grace in his arms and looking at the faces of the people who had become his entire world. "I want to say something." The family grew quiet, recognizing the tone that meant Samuel was about to share something important. "A year ago, I placed an advertisement seeking a cook. I thought I knew what I needed. Someone to help with domestic chores, someone to make winter more convenient. I had no idea I was actually asking for my life back." He looked at each of them in turn. Mary, whose love had healed wounds he'd thought were permanent. Daniel, whose trust had given him purpose beyond mere survival. Catherine, whose courage had reminded him that family was about protection and nurture rather than control. And Sarah Grace, who represented all the tomorrows they would build together. "You didn't just answer my advertisement," Samuel continued, his voice rough with emotion. "You answered prayers I was too afraid to pray. You gave me back everything I thought I'd lost forever. Love, family, hope for the future, and the chance to be the man I'd forgotten I could be." Mary's eyes filled with tears as she stood to embrace her husband and daughter. "We gave each other everything, Samuel. That's what families do. They save each other." As they settled around the table to share their evening meal, the conversation flowing as naturally as the creek that ran behind their cabin, Samuel realized that his story had come full circle. The lonely mountain man who had given up on love had found it again in the most unexpected way. Through strangers who had become family and refugees who had become his reason for everything. The advertisement that had started it all was long forgotten, lost among the papers in some territorial office or blown away by mountain winds. But its legacy lived on in the laughter of children, the contentment of a woman who had found safety and love, and the profound satisfaction of a man who had learned that the greatest courage wasn't in facing the wilderness alone, but in opening his heart to the possibility that some gifts were worth any risk. Outside, the mountain night settled over their valley with the eternal peace of the high country. Inside the cabin, a family that had been forged from desperate circumstances and unexpected love prepared for sleep. Secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, they would face them together. Samuel Creek had sought a cook and found his salvation. In return, he had offered shelter and discovered his purpose. It was, he reflected, as he watched his wife settle their baby for the night, exactly the kind of miracle that happened when lonely souls found the courage to hope for something better than mere survival. The mountains would always be there, wild and beautiful and unforgiving, but they were no longer his only companions. He had found what every person sought, but few were brave enough to accept: a place to belong, people to love, and a future bright with the promise of shared tomorrows. It was, Samuel thought as he closed his eyes and listened to the gentle breathing of his sleeping family, more than enough for any man's lifetime.